Many of you may know by now that LARPing has become one of my least favorite terms. People love to throw around this pejorative of live-action roleplay, the idea that people who are trying something out in their lives are doing so as if they were some kind of nerd going through the motions of some kind of cultural or aesthetic movement that they don't understand. Something disassociated from its original context that has therefore lost its deeper meaning and connections. I think the term originally had some utility, but now it's mostly used by misanthropes to mock those that are actually making some kind of effort in their lives. You see this all the time online, people saying, oh, you're not some buff Giga Chad, or you're not some deeply devoted religious family man, and so you need to stop advocating for or moving towards these goals because it's starting to make me feel uncomfortable. Because when people see others advocating for a standard and starting to hold themselves to that standard, well, they might feel some kind of pressure or duty or shame if they are not themselves moving towards that standard. And so tearing other people down who are actually trying to achieve goals in their lives becomes extremely important. And this crab in the bucket mentality that I see all the time, where people feel the need to destroy those who are trying to improve themselves and pull them down to their level, bothers me a lot, not just because it attacks these individuals who are genuinely trying to make an effort, but because it's also corrosive to a community that's attempting to better itself in general, that's attempting to hold itself to a higher standard. These people who are slandering others with the charge of LARPing often seem to think that if people cannot immediately embody some kind of archetype, if they cannot immediately become the perfect representation of what they are trying to be, well then they are some kind of hypocrite who needs to immediately be destroyed and discarded. But this is a terrible attitude to take, especially towards people who are struggling through a culture that tells them that there is no reason to pursue these virtues, or that pursuing these virtues is actually morally wrong. These people are already battling against the cultural zeitgeist. They're already battling against what everything tells them is popular, what everything tells them is the correct route. And to have these misanthropes come behind them and throw stones at them when they're trying to improve themselves is just the most ridiculous thing I can imagine. Simply because someone in a community does not immediately embody the perfection of some kind of ideal person or leader does not mean that they should just give up or stop trying or be attacked for their efforts. Where do people think these leaders come from? Do they think they just spring fully formed, being the perfect human to lead people into a new era? No. We are all touched by modernity. We all have the difficulties and barriers and burdens that come living in the kind of culture we live in now. And no one is immune to these ideas. No one is completely untouched by these. No one is unaffected by the kind of world we live in. And so everyone moving forward who's looking to better their life will be in some way LARPing, will in some way be looking at past archetypes and attempting to adapt them and move them into the future. Great men who came out of hard times in the past were mimicking the great men that came before them in more heroic eras. When you don't have great examples or inspirations in your current times, in your current culture, you must seek that inspiration from the past. But that does not mean that what you're doing is disingenuous. What you're doing is deeply necessary in order to move forward. Many people think that we are currently in a period of decline and transition. A period where many of the key virtues for leadership are no longer apparent in our own time, and where people have to reach back in order to understand those virtues and bring versions of them forward into the future. And this had me thinking about the idea of cultural transition in general. Those times where an entire nation or people or culture had to completely shift its mentality and its nature to prepare for something greater. One of the most famous stories in the Bible is, of course, when the Israelites have fled Egypt, they've been freed from slavery, and now they must wander in the desert for 40 years. There are many different interpretations as to why these people needed to wander in the desert for 40 years, but one of the most popular is the idea that 40 years is about the amount of time it takes for a generation to die out and be replaced. You see, the Israelites that had been freed by God from Egypt had a very specific mentality, a very specific attitude. They had lived their entire lives under slavery, and their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had lived under captivity. And they fundamentally had the mentality of slaves. Even though Moses had led them out of Egypt, and even though every time they ran into some kind of difficulty, God provided for them, still at every turn, whenever these people ran into some kind of problem, their response always seemed to be, well, we should have just returned to Egypt. We should just go back to Pharaoh. At least when we were slaves, we were provided for. At least when we were slaves, we were safe and we knew where our food was coming from. Their response is always to go back to captivity, to return to the type of life they knew. And it took about 40 years for them to replace this slave generation with a new generation that had grown up in freedom, that had grown up with the type of things that God was providing for them. And this was required to shift the mentality of the nation and the people, to shift their general approach toward freedom, captivity, and self-determination. While we have people in our generation who are looking to change things and make things better, we are all tainted by the different effects of modernity. None of us is pure, and none of us have the mentality of someone who is in a completely different age. How can we? We weren't born to it. While we can all work hard to reach back to the wisdom of older generations and find those ways of being and recover them and work towards better futures for ourselves and our families and our communities, we can never be perfect. We can never be completely unblemished by our experiences. And that's okay. That's necessary. We have to work through these transitional generations. As the old culture dies out and a new culture arises, we have different roles to play. Those that fight for the changes, those that fight through the transition, are often not those that will lead once things have actually moved on, once we're in a different place. Oswald Spengler in The Hour of Decision actually talks about how any competent leader, once the revolution is over, dismisses the men that actually won them the revolution. He might reward them, but in the end, the men who were necessary to make that transition are not the same men who are now needed to govern after the transition has been made. And we need to understand that the heroic archetypes of a past age may not be immediately obtainable. They may not be something that people of our time are able to organically achieve, but still we need to strive towards them. Still we need to make the effort because that transition has to take place. Because if people don't look back into the past, reach back and take what worked, and apply it to today, if they don't make that synthesis, create that bridge between old virtue and the new things that are now necessary to lead people forward, then we will simply never be able to pull ourselves out of this. It's terrible advice for the culture, but also it's very terrible advice for the individual. Because it leaves people wallowing in helplessness. If they can't immediately achieve the top goal, if they can't immediately become what they want to be, well then there's just no point trying because people are going to spend all their time tearing you down and deriding you and calling you a hypocrite and calling you a LARPer. And we simply cannot afford this negative mentality. People need hope. They need a vision of the future. Not just for themselves, but they need to be able to see the generations that will come after them and work towards bettering their future as well. We don't need to be accusing people of LARPing. We need to be encouraging people to become better versions of themselves, to invest in their family and their community and their futures. We need to become the generation who plants the seeds of trees that they will never sit under. Because if we don't do the work now, things only get worse, not better. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and click like. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, now is a great time to do so. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter or support my work on Subscribestar like the fantastic people who are currently being displayed on screen, you can do so by going to the description below the video and following the links there. That's also where you'll find links to my merch store and to my alt tech channels like Rumble and Odyssey. Please make sure to subscribe over there so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching, guys, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.